good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're all from. Welcome to this, the first episode, so to say, of the Zoroastrian Conversations. How this series came about and the genesis of that and where it will go in the coming weeks and months, I leave it to Johan to describe a little bit more. But first, let me take the opportunity to introduce Johan. Dr. Johan Vevaina is the Bahari Associate Professor of Sasanian Studies and a Fellow of the Wilson College at the University of Oxford in England. Johan was born in Mumbai and raised in the United States since he was 12. He's completed his PhD in Iranian and Persian Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University in 2007. Since then, Johan's taught at Harvard, Stanford, and the University of Toronto. Johan's the co-editor with Michael Strausberg of the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Zoroastrianism, which is the largest single-volume reference work on Zoroastrians at about 700 pages. Johan's academic specialty is the study of hermeneutics, or the theories of interpretation with a focus on the interpretations of the Gathas in the Sasanian and early Islamic centuries. In 2021, he completed a long-awaited 2-volume book project on the 9th book of the Denkard, our largest surviving Pahlavi text. On a very personal note, Johan's a great friend, not only of myself, but also of all of us over here at FEZANA. Johan's spoken at various North American and World Congresses, the last one last July in New York. And he's also been part of, FEZANA's advisory committee when we were doing the whole setting up and the search for the FEZANA professorship at the University of Toronto. And he's, amazingly accessible. If we have any question, all I need to do is send him a WhatsApp and I get a detailed answer on things that are way beyond my comprehension. So, I really value that a lot. And it's also symbolic in a way that our very first speaker of the series is the FEZANA professor of Zoroastrian languages and literature at the University of Toronto, Professor Miguel. So over to you, Johan.
Great. Thank you, Arzan. So thank you all for logging in today for this inaugural interview of the Zoroastrian Conversations. So I suppose some of you may be wondering why an academic based in England and teaching Sasanian studies is hosting an event on Zoroastrianism for the North American community. The answer is actually relatively simple. So Arzan and I cooked up this series as a way of introducing the Zoroastrian communities in North America, and for that matter in the world, to the various professional scholars of Zoroastrianism, Iranian and Parsi studies, and cognate fields working across the globe. So I hope that such an informal and collegial interview format will allow Zoroastrians to hear from all sorts of diverse and interesting minds producing cutting-edge research on Zoroastrianism in a fun and hopefully accessible way. We have one such person whom I feel is most deserving of being the inaugural interviewee for a FEZANA-sponsored event. So Professor Miguel Ángel Andres-Toledo is the FEZANA Professor in Zoroastrian Languages and Literatures in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations at the University of Toronto. Miguel Ángel took up his post in the fall of 2022 after a highly successful fundraising campaign spearheaded by Homi Gandhi, Arda Minocher Homji, and others, including Arzan. And this helped to create the post which Miguel Ángel now has, and in a partnership with Professors Mohammad Tavakoli Targhi, Enrico Raffaelli, who I think is here, Tim Harrison, and Paul Alain Beaulieu at the NMC department at the University of Toronto. Besides his FEZANA connection, Miguel Ángel is truly an outstanding first choice for us, as he has previously held academic positions at the University of Salamanca, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the University of Copenhagen, and the Free University of Berlin, not to mention a prior stint at Toronto where he replaced me. So along the way, Miguel Ángel has worked on 10 highly prestigious international projects in the fields of Old and Middle Iranian languages and literatures, Zoroastrianism, and Indo-Iranian linguistics. These include some of the most seminal multi-person research projects in the digital humanities, like the Avestan Digital Archive run by Professor Alberto Cantera when he was at the University of Salamanca in Spain and now in Berlin, or the Middle Persian Dictionary Project, based at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem initially, and run by the late Professor Shaul Shaked, and now basically working through Bochum with Professor Kianush Rezonia. So Miguel Angel's research interests cover the Avestan and Pahlavi languages and literatures, with a specific focus on the Pahlavi translations and exegeses of Avestan texts, and that's something we share in common in a sense, and especially their written transmission in our surviving manuscripts. He has published over 30 articles, including a survey on Avestan and Pahlavi texts for our Wiley-Blackwell companion to Zoroastrianism, which Arzan just mentioned. And so a little shameless plug. This 700-page reference work, with 33 world authorities, has now just appeared in paperback in December 2022, and I encourage all of you to buy a copy. It is really something that has, in a sense, created a platform for seeing where the field was 5 years ago, in a sense. And of course, the revised edition has some new bibliography and a few updates, and mention people's changing of their institutions and such. Miguel Angel has also published 3 books, including a Sanskrit Catalan dictionary in 2005, a book in Spanish entitled El hilo de la vida, el lazo de la muerte en la tradición indo-irania, or otherwise translated as The Thread of Life and the Bond of Death in the Indo-Iranian tradition in 2010, and most recently his meticulous Avestan text edition, The Zoroastrian Law to Expel the Demons, Videvdat 10-15, critical edition, translation, and glossary of the Avestan and Pahlavi texts, published in 2016 in the prestigious Iranica series, edited by Alberto Cantera and Maria Matsuk. So I first encountered Miguel Angel at the 6th Conference of Iranian Studies held in Vienna in September 2017, where he delivered a brilliant and extremely well-received paper that was eventually co-published with Professor Cantera in 2008 in the Journal of the K.R. Kama Oriental Institute. And it was entitled The Transmission of the Pahlavi Videvdat in India After 1700, Jamasp's Visit from Iran and the Rise of a New Exegetical Movement in Surat. The talk and the subsequent tour de force publication not only established him as a superb and meticulous philologist, but also demonstrated his ability to make meaningful interventions in our still impressionistic understandings of the medieval Zoroastrian priestly communities and their knowledge production. It also demonstrated his ability to historicize often highly abstruse and technically challenging texts and their bedeviling transmissional histories. It is these attributes that characterize all his published works, which I find to be not only immensely erudite, but equivalently novel in how they frame textual problems, how they deploy codicological evidence, that is with manuscripts, and ultimately suggest new and novel ways of reinterpreting Zoroastrian pasts. So with that rather lengthy introduction, but well-deserved, let us sort of kick off. So, Miguel Angel, just tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and how you got interested in this crazy business. That's the study of Zoroastrianism.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind introduction. I don't know if well deserved, but at least thank you, very kind. So my name, as you know, Miguel Ángel Andrés-Toledo. I'm from Valencia, a city in the Mediterranean part of Spain. I was born and raised there. I was studying classical philology in my hometown in Valencia. And then I got interested into Sanskrit language. I was learning that by myself with the few grammars that were in the library. And thanks to a professor in ancient history at that university, I got in contact with the professors in Salamanca who were responsible for teaching and doing research on Indo-Iranian languages. And then I met Alberto Cantera, who was my former supervisor, the supervisor of my PhD dissertation. And that's how I got interested into this very, very immense field, but of course, amazing and very interesting. And that's still what I'm doing, as you see.
So what year did you sort of get into the work?
What, sorry?
What year did you start working on Iranian and Zoroastrian material?
Actually, well, I was doing my first research before the PhD, so more than 20 years ago, I would say. Yeah. So beginning of the 2003 or whatever, yeah, approximately.
And you had studied Sanskrit before, is that how I understand it? So when you look at the Sanskrit material and then you sort of come to the Iranian world, what did you notice that was sort of similar, or what did you notice that was different?
Well, there are things, of course, that are similar because they share an Indo-European background and more concretely an Indo-Iranian background. So many things are inherited, of course, from a linguistic, from a cultural point of view, from many points of view. But of course, things are different because you have to take into account the context, you have to take into account the different developments through the millennia, through the centuries, different ideas. It's not just about the language. There are many things that are changing progressively. And of course, still the comparative view, the historical comparative view is necessary for many things to understand properly several things, but some others, of course, cannot be explained just because of the historical comparative method. So you have to take into account contextualization and many other things. Yeah.
So you mentioned sort of the comparative method. Maybe tell people, I mean, I know what you're talking about, but for people who don't actually translate these texts, it might be helpful to understand what you mean by that.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about the historical comparative method, we talk about a method that was mainly developed in the linguistic field and consists of tracing back all layers of languages by comparison with the different types of languages that belong to the same group and try to reconstruct older periods through comparison and also try to foresee different developments in later periods depending on certain rules that are shared by all these languages.
So when you first started encountering this material, I remember when I first started, reading the material in the original, I had very particularly powerful emotional reactions, coming from the Zoroastrian community. But from your perspective, when you first started reading it, what were the things that you noticed about the Iranian world that felt slightly different, let's say, than what you had experienced in Sanskrit?
Well, I mean, my access to the Sanskrit and Vedic material was, of course, very limited to the certain texts I was reading, some Vedas, some epic texts, some wisdom literature, and so on and so on. But my access to the Zoroastrian material was quite different. First, because I had a much deeper encounter with the Zoroastrian text thanks to Alberto, because Alberto provided me with contextualized text, with original sources, with very good studies about different texts. So it was not the same approach I had at the very beginning from a personal experience, I would say, because I was guided in that sense. I was not that lost as I was at the very beginning when trying to learn Sanskrit. So my experience was very different thanks to him, of course. Yeah.
So this is something that I think is often lost on people who don't do what we do, is that all of us who are operating at a relatively high level, or attempting to at least, we've all had teachers. And we've all had teachers who've had a very profound impact on our development. So for me, it was Dr. Shervo at Harvard. For you, it was Alberto. Perhaps, can you tell people a little bit about who Alberto is? And I say that because Alberto will be coming now in the spring to Oxford to give the Ratanbai Katrak lectures. And those are it's the 101st anniversary of the Katrak lectures. Some of the most famous luminaries in the field have given them. And I think, I will be advertising them next week, hopefully, right? But this is a sort of a preview of that. So, but maybe tell people, because I think it's important for people to understand that when we produce our scholarship, it is often in the context of some of the things that our teachers have done. Some we agree with, some we don't agree with, some they like less. But maybe you can just tell people a little bit about about Alberto, but also your context in studying in Salamanca, and what I suppose so people in North America can understand is the Spanish school of Zoroastrian studies, which is a very developed and producing some of the most cutting edge work in early Iranian philology.
Well, with Alberto, I had a very, very intensive training. I work a lot with him, of course, every day. I still remember even at the very beginning when I was still in need of more training with the Zoroastrian text. We met every day, basically, but even the weekends. I remember on Saturday going to his home at 8 o'clock in the morning to read directly from manuscripts, bilingual manuscripts. I mean, of course, in facsimile editions.
Yeah.
Reading directly the Avestan and the Pahlavi version. So directly, and he was asking me a lot of details about etymologies, meaning, how to read this, how to read that. I mean, it was a very intensive, but also very personal experience. So it's a different way of approaching the text, of course, because it's not just that you belong to a school, it's that you have a very personal relation with your teacher, the person who is training you in the end. And that creates a totally different atmosphere, of course. Yeah.
And that's exactly my experience as well. You know, I remember I used to work with Shervo, and we read, we read multiple different classes across the day. And I remember one term, I forget what year it was, but it must have been in the late 90s or very early 2000s. And I worked with him some 25 or 26 hours a week, which is basically 5 hours a day, every day. And at the end of every day, he would say, "Oh, go away," you know. And then essentially I would, come back the next day and we'd get going again. So, but
I must confess, sorry to interrupt, that in my case, there were many more hours.
Of course, well,
but still,
it shows. And I think that's an important part that I think is really, again, needs to be sort of emphasized. And one of the reasons to have these kind of discussions is for people to get a sort of a little bit of a view into the inner workings of what we do, not just when we go and present in a public forum for the Zoroastrian communities, or when people read, a blog, or they look at a book or an article. And we have invested many man hours, and forgive the gender language, but we've invested many hours of working time to develop our skills, and in your case it shows. So tell us a little bit about what you're working on currently.
Currently, I'm working, apart from different articles, on several other topics. I'm trying to finish, and I'm very advanced, but I would like to publish it as soon as possible, a few months or perhaps 1 year. I'm finishing my study on not only on the critical edition of texts that I was working in the last 3-4 years, the critical edition of the Avestan, Pahlavi, and also Sanskrit version of the Videvdat, the Vendidat 8-9, which deals, as you know, mainly with the Varshnum ceremony. And I'm also tracing back through all the textual layers from the Avestan period until the late text, even in New Persian, the variants of the ceremony according to the main text that preserve it. And that's what I'm doing, or try to finish.
There's music to my ears. And the reason is, so myself and R.S. Zaini, who's also here in the chat, we have just been given a contract to produce a critical edition with a historical intro and such a proper book on the epistles of Manuscripts, these 3 letters of Manuscripts, the high priest of Kerman, and he wrote these 3 letters, in, as you know, in 818 AD. And the letters, of course, are about his relationship with his brother, his actual brother, Zadspram, who was the high priest in Sirjan, and connected with Zadspram, essentially simplifying some of the rituals. And so he yesterday morning, we were reading the section where basically Manuscher says that the Varshnum is not something that is an option. It is something that is fundamental to the life of the Zoroastrian communities, and so he critiques him. So this will be very, very useful, and hopefully, I think these things will be mutually reinforcing. So I'm very, very excited to hear this. It's the first I actually am hearing about it, so this is great. But tell people a little bit about the type of genre that, in a sense, that you work on, in terms of what we would call Avestan and Zand, and perhaps just so people can understand what it is that we are looking at when we are looking at these manuscripts, because our sources are quite varied and they have all sorts of different texts, different genres. They appear in different styles in the manuscripts.
Well, of course, as you know, it depends on the type of text you are working about, because some texts contain a list of topics that are very varied. For instance, I have been working in the last years with several chapters of the Vendidat, of the Videvdat, and as you know, there are many different topics there. I mean, depending on the text, you would have a different type of genre. But when we are dealing with this type of text, we have to take into account, at least in my case, I'm taking a look to the Avestan text originally, but also to the Pahlavi translation. And I'm very interested in trying to not only just to edit the text and that's it from a very philological point of view, I try also to understand how the text developed, how the text was interpreted and later on reinterpreted, because this is part of the Zoroastrian history. It's not just doing a text, looking at the manuscripts, and that's it. I mean, it's also tracing back the history of Zoroastrianism, the history of Zoroastrian concepts, ideas, culture, heritage throughout different linguistic, cultural, historical layers, literary layers, and trying to understand how this, I mean, you know perfectly, this is something you are working on many years also, just the hermeneutics behind that, but also how things are differently interpreted. I mean, there are different opinions. It's not a monolithic thing. And I try to understand how things develop and why.
I think that's very important. And this is something that I think I've tried to always emphasize when I have talked to Zoroastrians. People say to me, so what does Zoroastrianism say about topic X, you know, whatever it may be? And in a certain sense, the answer is always sort of nothing, because there is not a single Zoroastrianism we're dealing with, right? We have a broad, very diverse tradition that has continuities through time. But within that, even in the various sources, we're seeing all sorts of different divergent opinions. So even when we're looking at a text, for example, as you say, when you're looking at the Videvdad, we will still find sort of different types of commentaries built in. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they disagree. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that we, as moderns, we sometimes have this notion that everything is very chaotic in the present, and in the past was this, everything was perfect and everyone was happy, but it's not actually like that. In many ways, the tensions of the social tensions of the present are completely embedded in the manuscripts of the past. I mean, and I think it's an important point that you make, which is that Zoroastrian history, culture, society, ways of thinking, that's not to be found out in the air somewhere. You know, in the past, it can only be found in the manuscripts, in the archaeological material that survives as best as it can, and also with what other communities and religious communities and cultures have said about Zoroastrianism. You can sort of triangulate it. But you said something and you paused a couple of times. So I would like to, it'd be helpful for people to understand, you know, you said, first you said Vendidad, then you said Videvdad, right? We have this tension in our field where we sort of use both terms. Maybe you could, people ask me this often in conferences and congresses. So what's the difference?
Actually, it's the same word, but the point is how we read it in the original Pahlavi source. I mean, Vendidad, as we know, I mean, this is something I would have to explain with a blackboard and with the original script in Pahlavi, but Vendidad has to do with a reinterpretation of the first letters of the way you write Videvdad in Pahlavi. The way you write Videvdad in Pahlavi, when you duplicate the W that can be also in the same letter, can be read as N or as R. If you write the initial W once, it's fine. But if you, by mistake or just because of whatever written tradition, you write it twice, you can write W, N. You can pronounce that. And that's most probably the origin of that double interpretation, Vendidad and Videvdad. But it's an old one. We already find it in the Pahlavi sources. So,
yes. And I just, the other day, I just read something. I was looking at a manuscript and I noticed they actually had the reading without the N, which actually looks like what we would have historically, etymologically expected. And I think that's another important point for people to understand is that when we're looking at this material, you know, we use etymology as a sort of control mechanism. But at the same time, what we're trying to do is to look at how the Zoroastrian communities interpreted the various symbols that they have and they've inherited, their rituals, and how that sort of produces meaning. So let me turn to something slightly different and, you know, maybe a little bit more on the personal side. What is your favorite book or article in the field? Do you have one?
Well, actually, I don't have one because I would have many, actually, because I have many in my library that I consult very often. And I could say, well, I don't know if they are my favorite, but at least the ones that I use the most. But I think at least one of them deserves a special mention, I would say. I mean, many of them, depending on the topic, of course, you can quote. hundreds of articles and books that are extremely important for our field in many senses, from different scholars, from different perspectives, from different approaches, and also, of course, from different disciplines. But if I have to, let's say, choose one, I think a very meritorious one, apart, of course, from Gellner's critical edition, Vesteko's edition, Spiegel, and so on, I would say one of the sometimes less quoted, and not because of that less important, is Christian Bartholome's dictionary, the dictionary of Avestan and Old Persian. Of course, the part of Old Persian has been totally renewed and in different studies by Rüdiger Schmidt and some other scholars. But so far, we still don't have, some scholars, Alberto and some others, are working on a new version of that dictionary, of Avestan dictionary. But still, we don't have anything equivalent to replace it in more than 100 years. Yeah. That's a huge work. And so important for our field, because when we are dealing with the text, sometimes we forget, in order to understand the text, of course, apart from many other things related to the context, the first thing we need is a dictionary, apart from the text, from the original text. Who produced that dictionary and how long took it to produce it? I have also worked in other lexicographical projects and so, and I know how long it takes to produce a dictionary. And when you see it, sometimes you don't really realize the huge amount of work that is behind it. And in the case of the dictionary by Christian Bartolome, this is just amazing, amazing.
It's worth keeping in mind, right, that when we do our work today, we have word processing, cut and paste, we have all these,
but
options.
He didn't. He didn't.
That was just done purely with, with fountain pen and paper, right?
Yeah.
And it's worth saying also, and this is one of the things that I'm really glad you mentioned this, because this Bartholome's dictionary is an incredible work, published in 1904, and in a sense, the state of the art at the end of the 19th century, I think is probably the best way to describe it, right? Now, but therein lies a problem with it for Zoroastrians, because he published it in German.
No.
Because we don't have a replacement, and besides that, because the replacement is so difficult, in a certain sense, a really highly technical, professional level approach to Avestan is impossible without the ability to work with Bartolome in the German, and that to the Bavarian German, right? So and this is something which I think is something that's been very important to me, and I feel like it's what I like to communicate to community members, is that knowledge production is shaped by society, and then in a sense society is then shaped by the knowledge production. So if we have a bottleneck or an inefficiency in how the knowledge is produced or how the technical work is distributed, in a sense you land up with these kind of social challenges. And at least compared to when we were grad students all those years ago, the last 15 years have changed the field dramatically, and there's so much more emphasis and attention to making more publicly accessible scholarly tools. So that's a really important point, and I'm glad that it was Bartolome that you chose. So let me turn to a slightly different, sort of related, but it's a different question. What is this? If someone would, I was recently asked this by someone in the sciences. I was at a college dinner and they said, what's your research question? So what is the central research question or questions that motivate you?
Well, that would be, of course, a quite difficult thing to answer, because it depends what you are doing in a concrete research. Your question would be totally different. Sometimes you just come up with something you think no one realized, and then, of course, your research question is a very particular one for solving that concrete problem. But in general terms, let's say in very general terms, what's something that could guide my research from the, let's say, the beginning since today, and of course, perhaps even in the coming years? Again, for me, the important thing is to try to find out how this chain of knowledge developed, not only originated, but developed, how things are interpreted and reinterpreted. That's, again, one of my main research questions. I mean, not only how, but also why. when we are dealing sometimes with the idea of what has been lost, I mean, some other scholars talk about that already. I don't focus on what's lost. I focus on what's preserved. And I try to understand why it's preserved. What does it mean that it's preserved and how it has been interpreted and reinterpreted because it is preserved. So that's one of my main research questions. How, why, who, and so on.
So if I remember correctly, you worked on a project on textiles at one point.
Mm-hmm.
This was in Copenhagen, am I correct?
Yeah, in Copenhagen, yeah. 2
Yeah.
years with a Marie Curie fellowship.
Yeah, which for those who are not based in Europe, Marie Curie fellowships are extremely prestigious pan-European fellowships. They're very, very difficult to get. So one thing that I've always felt that sort of separated you from some of the other sort of scholars who essentially have just worked with facsimiles is that you've always had some genuine interest in the materiality, the physicality and materiality of the materials. So I know that you have taken a good number of archival trips, that you have done fundamental, archival research and hunting for manuscripts in India and in Iran. So can you tell us a little bit about your experiences sort of looking at manuscripts in the sort of the home countries, so to speak, for the vast bulk of Zoroastrian communities?
I mean, for people like me who not only appreciate, who love the text they are reading, it was a very moving experience the first time I had a manuscript in my hands. And if I'm not wrong, I think it was in the Kama Oriental Institute in Mumbai. The first time I had a manuscript in my hands, I touched it like a baby, very carefully, trying to open every single page very carefully. I still do that, by the way. Every time I touch a manuscript, I respect the original, its materiality. I think it's extremely important to deal with a lot of care with those texts, because of course they are the result of many, many, many centuries of transmission. For me, they are extremely important in all senses. I mean, people like me who are dealing with the languages, with the manuscripts, really appreciate why they are important. They are extremely important for our field in many senses, because they are, in most cases, actually, the only remnants of many centuries of tradition. We have to read them. We need to read them directly, to know how they are produced, why they are produced like that, how they are transmitted, where are they, because sometimes people not dealing with them are not totally conscious why they are so important for us. I always just have an example. I mean, many times it happened to me. Suddenly you find a manuscript of a concrete text you are interested in because of your research, but suddenly you find that in this concrete manuscript there are a lot of things that no one knew before, or new texts, or things that are just totally different to the things we know so far. If we didn't have access to that manuscript, no one ever would know about that. That's so important for the history of Zoroastrianism. I mean, there are so many things inside the manuscripts that we still don't know. There are still, of course, so many manuscripts we still don't know that can change totally our view, not only about concrete topics of Zoroastrianism, but also about their texts, their languages, the priestly families that cope with them, so many things that are extremely relevant for research, but also for the history of Zoroastrianism and for the Zoroastrian communities. So it's not just about scholars, it's also about Zoroastrians.
It's funny that you say this. My first experience with a real manuscript, I think, was also in the Kama Institute. The only difference is you held it like a baby, except I kept touching I'm very fidgety, so I kept touching my face with all the DDT powder in the manuscripts. So not so wise. But you bring up a very important point. And I think this is something that is, again, really, really worth reiterating, that the ability to look and the effort to go and to look at a manuscript which has never been published, which people even may have forgotten about, or it's misplaced, or is fundamental to what we do. Because otherwise, oftentimes you'll end up at seeing sort of fruit from a poison tree. The other day I was working on a piece, and I was doing some checking of the bibliography. I found a reference. I went looking. I went somewhere else, and then I was doing the proofs of my book, which should be around the corner any day now, sometime in the spring. And I was checking the references, and the reference in what I was working on and the reference that I had, the same reference in the book, didn't match. So I went looking in Encyclopedia Ionica, I hunted it down, and it still didn't match. And little by little, I discovered that the Encyclopedia Ionica entry is wrong, and everyone's been copying it more or less. It's just a silly bibliographical reference, but they just have the date wrong, the page number wrong. And it's a small example of how, there's no substitute for actually doing the sort of the legwork yourself. And I think this is something which is what I think has really separated you from so many people before, because in a certain sense, we've always had people who made that effort. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think, I can see that Almut is on here, Almut Hinze, the senior professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS in London. I mean, she has done tremendous things in terms of helping us get access to manuscripts, to publish them, to put up facsimiles, and that really has transformed the field. But this is something that is just fundamental for producing sort of important and basic work. So given that you've been looking at these manuscripts and you've been reading all this material, what is the coolest or most surprising thing about Zoroastrianism that you've read in your studies of these manuscripts? Something that you found interesting.
Many things. I would have to think about any concrete. Again, depending on the text, but sometimes, I mean, something that was for me extremely interesting is when I found in an Iranian manuscript, something that was never found before, and totally changed my view about the text also. I mean, it was a manuscript of the Videvdat, a liturgical manuscript that incorporated an interlinear Pahlavi translation that was for me amazing, because it was also going back to a different line of the transmission. I mean, there are some studies about that, but when I was checking that, I said, that's simply fascinating. It was the first time I have seen that. And that was for me very, very important for many things, of course. And then, of course, reading certain texts, depending on the manuscript, depending on the text, I found many, many, many interesting things. And also, not only from the history of Zoroastrianism, also from a literary point of view, things that are just beautiful to read. I mean, they are interesting for people approaching Zoroastrianism, for students also, different type of texts in the Pahlavi literature. I mean, there are also a lot of very beautiful texts to be read. So there are many cool things, I would say. It would be difficult to choose one.
So maybe just to clarify something, because it may not be obvious to everyone. When you said a liturgical Videvdat with an interlinear Pahlavi, why is that so interesting?
Because in this type of manuscripts, we usually either have manuscripts that are just for liturgical use, that contain the whole ceremony in the original language, in Avestan, but there are some others that include the Avestan and the Pahlavi translation, sometimes the translation into later languages like Sanskrit or, New Persian or Gujarati, but usually they are two totally different types of manuscripts, and they are not frequently, or at least to my knowledge, at least just I know one of them, they are not usually mixed, at least in this type of text. So whenever you find one, it's such a rare thing that is very relevant for us, of course. I mean, in other types of texts, in the Yasna and some other texts, that's a little bit different. But in this type of text, that's something very, very interesting, of course.
I think, yeah, so I think this is something that is not always very obvious to people. And it wasn't, I must confess, it wasn't very obvious to me when I first started working on this material. I knew that there were Avestan texts, and I knew there were Pahlavi translations, and I didn't know much more than that. But when you start to look more closely, you sort of see that we have some Avestan texts that are basically what we can see in the notes on the side and the commentary and things that they're designed for they are basically liturgical manuscripts. They're designed they're like applied for performing the actual rituals. And then we've got this other set of texts, which may be the same text, but essentially they've got this Pahlavi or Sanskrit or whatever translations, and they are then basically almost more like something like an interpretation of the ancient Avestan material, and then built into that is essentially all the hermeneutics, the commentaries. And so this is something that it speaks to something, I think, my personal view, it speaks to something about how in the past we had a certain degree of priestly specializations, because we have Manuschar himself talks about these things. He says there are some priests who know the Avesta, but they don't know the Zand, the Pahlavi. And there are some who know the Zand extremely well, but they don't really perform the Avesta. So some were basically, ritual priests, and some of them were trained to be scholastic priests. And there were clearly rivalries between them and things like that. So that's quite interesting, because it gives us a little window, as into the social world, as you were saying. So let me sort of transition to another question. What, in your opinion, is the future of Zoroastrian philology and textual studies? Now, you have got this fantastic job, and you have the title Languages and Literatures in your job, but one person can do immense things, as we see with Bartolome and others. But what do you think the future of the field looks like? And what would you like the future of the field to look like? How about that?
Well, the future of the field, of course, is something we have to build up together. So it's not something we can do from a personal point of view. I mean, we all have to collaborate in the future of the field in many, many senses. But if we have to be very specific about the future of Zoroastrian philology, I would say that Zoroastrian philology first will have to be collaborative. We will have to collaborate because there are a huge amount of texts, and not a single person, not even a single group of scholars in one university can deal with that, because we know that's not possible from a temporal point of view, because projects are usually not that long, and we need a huge effort, a huge amount of scholars, a very specialized knowledge in order to produce quality research. And of course, there are many things that have been done that are still running, different projects by Alberto Cantera, by Almut Hinze, by Kianush Rezania, and some other scholars. But I think we will have to reach a point in which everything merged in a single platform. And of course, the future, we like it or not, the future must be digital, because that doesn't mean, by the way, that because of being digital, we have to forget about our very strong training, strong philological training, our very good knowledge of the primary sources, because this is the only way. It's not just about producing quantitative research, but also qualitative research. So we still need our solid training in philology, our good knowledge of the manuscripts, of the texts they contain, how to read them, and so on. But I'm sure that the future must be digital because of a very practical reason. You can just see it, not just in the research, also in the students and in the interested public. Everything that is not digitized and available online will be basically invisible. No one will see it. No one would be knowing anything about that. They will not even know that exists. And we can see in our students, if you just tell them, please go to the library and check that book, the first thing they will ask, is that online? If that's not online, 90% of probabilities it will not be checked. So
exactly
the same happened with the manuscripts, the same happened with a lot of materials. If they are not digitized and studied according to some criteria and some other things, they basically will be invisible. And if they are invisible, they will become irrelevant. And that's a danger, in my opinion.
I agree. I mean, it's worth saying, right, that if you and I had this conversation and I had invited you to Oxford and we were in the room together, I think we would get 30, 40 people. We have 99 people.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thanks to all of you for being here.
Yeah, but that's precisely it, right? So I think another aspect that I would like to add to this, which I agree with you 100%, is that digital platforms allow us to bridge the gaps between the geographical sort of distribution that Zoroastrians have all over the world. And it also allows people to say, you could have someone here on listening to us who is in Tehran, who would never be able to necessarily come very easily to, let's say, Bombay, or someone from Bombay would not very easily be able to go to Paris, or someone from Paris would not very easily be able to be, in Los Angeles or wherever the case may be. So I think that's quite important. But I want to actually ask you something, and this is something that I think is important. I've been thinking about this for a long time. We're still, relatively speaking, in the early days of what we would call, the digital world in that sense, right? Obviously now we have, virtual reality, augmented reality, things are changing quite rapidly in those veins as well. But what happens to digital projects like the ones that you have worked on over all these years when the custodians of those projects are no longer able to maintain them? In the sense that, if I publish a book, the worst that happens is the book goes out of print, but the book will be somewhere. Whereas when we have these digital projects, if the funding runs out, or if the main person running it passes away, what happens? You have this sort of lead person risk. How should we, as sort of scholars and community members, how should we be thinking about our sort of digital posterity?
Well, that's a very important thing in all digital projects, and that's one of the things that is evaluated also in many projects. When you apply for a project, is the problem of durability, as you mentioned. And durability can be solved when these type of projects are linked to the university and they are part of their websites. It's not just you have an independent project with your own website, because of course that will die when the person just cannot have any funding for the project by many other reasons. So the important thing first is that these projects are linked to the universities in which those scholars work, and that they are available through those universities. And in the case of certain manuscripts that are digitized in libraries, that they are also part of their digital library in the collection. Because if you just have one or the other, the risk is higher. So in my opinion, things like, for instance, the websites of the important libraries in Europe that contain Zoroastrian manuscripts, like the Library of Paris, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the library in Copenhagen, the library in London, the British Library, all of them are building day by day, month by month, a bigger collection of digitized manuscripts. So they belong to very important institutions, and their websites will not disappear in 10 years, let's say. Yeah. So if they are stored there, we know that they will not be lost. And also with the projects, with the digital projects, if they are linked to the university, not just as unipersonal projects to the university, then we know that their durability is also granted. So okay, that's very important.
Yeah. So I think people would like to ask some questions. I'll ask you one last one, and then we can open it up to questions. How can we grow the field? And more importantly, how do we make the field more accessible to community members as scholars?
How to make the field grow is, of course, a very difficult question, because it doesn't depend on us scholars. Many times it depends on the academic authorities, on the universities, the creation of positions, the future for the younger generations. We both have been very lucky, because now we have a position that is a permanent position, but we know that several scholars in the field who are very good scholars still don't have a permanent position after many, many years of working very hard. So initiatives like the initiative by FEZANA of creating positions in the field are extremely important, not only for scholars, but especially for the community, because they are making visible the Zoroastrian heritage. They are promoting their research, their public interest, they are teaching, many things related to that. So that's extremely important for the community. But of course, how we make it also relevant for the community? Collaborating, because we also scholars need to collaborate in many sense. It's not that we just take information from the community and that's it, or try to make lectures for them
knowing, I mean, showing how much we know about a field. No, we also have to get knowledge from them. We have to collaborate. We have to talk exactly at the same level because we benefit each other. I mean, initiatives, for instance, I'm collaborating now with the Zoroastrian glossary project, things that are also relevant for the community. I mean, the community has also needs, and we as scholars can help in these things as much as we can, of course, with our knowledge and with our approaches. But I think it's very important that we collaborate, that we just cooperate. That's enhancing the field, and that will grant its interest also for the future generations. So I think that's very relevant.
That's great. I couldn't agree more. So let's open it up to some questions. How do we do this? Questions.
Okay, so there's a bunch of questions on the chat, and I'm just going to go down quickly, and then if there are other responses to that, we can continue. So the first one is from Karishma, and she says, in the context of teachers, learning and building wisdom about the Zartusti Dena requires the inputs of Airwoods and Mobeds. Please help us understand how you will request their guidance in your scholarly work.
In many, many things, I mean, when we have doubts, and we have many doubts, of course, when reading the text about certain topics, we always consult the Zoroastrian authorities, the Zoroastrian priests. I mean, I have several times written emails, for instance, to Dasturji Kotbal, asking him about certain problems I didn't understand properly in the text. And his guidance was, of course, extremely important, very helpful, and only then I could understand. So, of course, for us, it's very important, very, very important, the opinion of the priests.
So if I had to take that thought to a slightly linear, slightly lateral tangent, there was a time in the early 20th century, all the way till, all through the 20th century, when there were a lot more scholar priests. Today, there are very few, if in far, what I mean is, scholar priests who have kind of gone through both the formal training of being a priest and also the formal training of being a scholar. Is that something that community should worry about? I mean, because, there is a whole, what you guys as scholars can do is one thing, and then what priests can do is one thing. To kind of have both of that and an entity like Dasturji Kotwal or Airwood Ramyar Karanjia, where do we have that? I mean, and we don't have that anymore. I don't see many more coming up. So is that something that the community should wonder about?
I mean, it would be very interesting that, of course, that priests could also be trained from a scholarly point of view and produce the huge amount of work, and very important work, like, for instance, Erbat Karanjia and Dasturji Kotbal have done, because they are very important for our field, because they have the concrete knowledge of the ritual, the concrete knowledge of the interpretation of the religion from an inner perspective, and that's for us very, very relevant, very important. So, of course, it would be always welcome if there are many more Zoroastrian priests that can be also trained in the scholarly activity. I mean, I myself work every day with a lot of very important research done by Zoroastrian priests in the last decades, in the last century. There was a time in which basically there were a lot of texts that were only published and only worked by Zoroastrian priests and by Zoroastrian scholars. And they are, even today, after 70 years in many cases and even more, they are extremely important for us. They are reference for our work. And I think that would be, of course, a desideratum, but that's something, of course, that depends on their activities, on the community, and many things that depend on them, of course. So
yeah, and if I can jump in, when Arish Zaini and I read for our edition, we work now every morning for a couple of hours, 2-3 hours, Monday through Friday, and we are consistently looking at Kanga's translations. We're consistently looking at Dabar's edition. We have to look at this material, and it's worth saying that what the Zoroastrian scholar priests produced in the late 19th all the way to basically, let's say, give or take the late 70s, that's the window in which they produced the most amount of work. And that's leaving aside, of course, Dastur Kotwal and Jamas Paso and others, and both of them had PhDs from Western universities. What was produced was immensely valuable. And there's no reason that that cannot happen again. But in order for that to be the case, you have to have people who are willing to be priests and trained to be priests and really care about it, but they have to be equivalently dedicated to being trained as scholars. And that's not something that the challenge of that, of course, I think, is a remuneration game, which is that priests in India, especially, and I know the Indian situation better than Iran, so I'll just speak for that, are not paid well at all. And they're not, in many cases, there's a lot of nominal respect shown to them, but without any actual sort of, putting one's money where one's mouth is. And then from the scholarly perspective, being a scholar of a field like this is a very scary proposition, because the chances that you will succeed are exceedingly small because there's so few jobs. I remember in sort of 2000, and it must have been 2016, when I was leaving to come here, and Miguel Ángel had decided to come and visit, and we were discussing, we met in Toronto, and he was wondering whether or not there would ever be a real opportunity to have a permanent job somewhere. And it makes me so immensely happy to see that that's happened. But that's the thing, when you have someone who is doing world-class work and they don't have a job because people haven't invested in it. And this is basically a game of investment. If the investment comes, then the personnel follow in that sense. And once the people follow, then they can produce material. The more material you have, the more you can learn, more people get interested. And it's just a kind of, it goes from being a vicious circle to being a virtuous circle. But maybe we can take the next question.
Sure. So the next one is from Kushru Bagli. Dear Professor Miguel, please provide a brief chronological summary of the various ancient and relatively modern languages involved with the Zoroastrian studies, with a special emphasis on the Gathas and the Zend-Avesta.
Very broad, of course, we have to debate each single step, but a very broad chronology of the main Zoroastrian languages would be the first, the oldest of them would be Avestan. Avestan has, according to scholars, 3 different linguistic layers. One is what we call Old Avestan, which basically contains the Gathas, the Yasna-Haptan Haitins, and prayers. We also have a variety that we call Middle Avestan. It was discovered by a very important scholar who passed away, Xavier Tremblay. And we also have the layer of Young Avestan. So these are the 3 main layers in Avestan from a linguistic point of view. Chronology, that's of course very debated. We are not totally sure, but approximately, more or less the communist opinion, the common opinion, which of course some new approaches, is that from the 2nd millennium to the 1st millennium before the Common Era, Avestan was spoken. So broadly saying, and of course in those layers, Old Avestan is the oldest. That's everything we can say from a linguistic point of view. Going to Pahlavi, which is the next in the importance and of course also antiquity of the Zoroastrian languages, I myself distinguish 3 different layers in Pahlavi. Sasanian Pahlavi, which is from the 3rd to the 7th century of the Common Era. It contains basically the Pahlavi translations of Avestan texts and some other inscriptions and some other things. We also have what I call classical Pahlavi from the 8th to the 10th, even 11th century of the Common Era. Most of the important texts of the Pahlavi literature were composed then. And then we also have what I call Neo-Pahlavi, which is from the 11th or 12th, approximately, to even the 19th century of the Common Era. It contains new Pahlavi translations of texts that were not preserved in the oldest manuscripts, some ritual instructions in manuscripts and some other texts. These are basically. Then we jump to the Sanskrit translations of Avestan texts. That's also debated. We are not totally sure, but we can say approximately from the 12th to the 14th or 15th century of the Common Era. Then all Gujarati texts, the oldest, are from the 15th century of the Common Era. And then, of course, Gujarati is still spoken, is one of the important languages of the Indian community, so until today. And New Persian, there are certain texts that we are not sure about their chronology, like the Sadar and some others, but basically some of the most important texts, which are the Revayat in New Persian, spread from the 15th century to the 18th century of the Common Era. And of course, New Persian is still spoken in the Iranian communities of Zoroastrians, with some local dialects and local languages like Dari, Zoroastrian Dari, and so on. So these are, very broadly speaking, an overview of the main Zoroastrian languages.
If I can throw in one little detail, it's absolutely, 100%. I would have given virtually the same answer. So I think in that sense, it's the standard view. But it is worth saying that we also have here and there evidence of things that essentially haven't survived, but must have been at a bigger scale. So we have the Hashem Vohu prayer.
The Sogdian, in Parthian perhaps even.
Yeah, which is super interesting because it shows us that, it's worth saying that Avestan has always been a sacred liturgical language. We don't have, Zoroastrians don't pray Avestan prayers in other languages. They may read the translation of the other languages, but it's not part of the performance. Whereas this Sogdian text shows us that vernaculars were used for the Zoroastrian, for sort of Zoroastrian knowledge production, which is quite important, I think. And I think it's also worth saying that sometimes we forget, right? And if I can add one thing, we forget that Zoroastrians have been producing quite a bit of, let's call it, religious and scholarly knowledge in English. I mean, we treat it sort of neutral, but yes, so it's worth saying that we've had so much interesting work has been put out in English as well. So Arzan, should we go to the next?
So the next one is from Karishma. She's like, you mentioned the role of the dictionaries. Our priests like Erwet Kanga produced a superb dictionary. Current scholars Ramyar Karangia and past luminaries Dasturji Minocherhomji and Dasturji Kanga had knowledge of Sanskrit, and they have helped understand many details of the Avestan words. How do you utilize your knowledge of Sanskrit?
Well, I know, of course, those dictionaries, which are very, very, very important from many different points of view. They include, of course, the inner interpretation of the text, and that's, of course, very valuable for us. And we also know, of course, that a lot of priests and scholars in India had a very good knowledge of Sanskrit, and that's, of course, very valuable for us. I mean, some of the important, very important, actually, studies about the Sanskrit translations of Avestan texts and also Pahlavi texts were produced by Parsi scholars. I mean, we have Parucha, we had, of course, many other editions and studies of them. So they are for us reference books. So for sure.
I think it's also worth mentioning, Miguel Ángel, I think she's also sort of asking, how do you use Sanskrit in the study of Zoroastrianism? Because we typically think of it as an Iranian phenomenon, right? So
yeah, but we don't have to forget that there are a lot of texts translated into Sanskrit, a lot of them. Few of them are preserved in comparison with the amount that might have been produced, but they are very important to understand not only the translation as such, let's say the Sanskrit interpretation or reinterpretation of that. Sometimes, and that's also very important, they compare when they are translating the text into Sanskrit, they are not just following the Pahlavi equivalent, as we always think. Many times they are comparing with the original Avestan, and that's also very important. We don't have to forget it. Sanskrit translations in some cases contain different lines of transmission that also reveal in the way they translate that they were translating from an original that is lost. So they are also important to know what was before these Sanskrit translations. So they are also important by themselves. So they must be studied also, of course.
And I think if I can just add something here, and this brings to light a very important fundamental issue with the study of Zoroastrianism. Unlike many other religious communities, Zoroastrianism has this weird problem where it's among the very oldest of living communities, and at the same time, it has some of the most challenging aspects of its textual transmission and survivability. Much has been lost. So it is precisely when we see these little windows into a Sanskrit translation that must have interpreted an Avestan that is not what we have, an Avestan text or an Avestan concept that we don't have, that's really a window into the basic problem of survivorship bias. That is, what survives for us is what we can reconstruct, but it doesn't really capture the incredible sort of diversity of the actual past. So, it would be like we have 100 people in this room, and instead of having 100 people write their experience of listening to us, we only have, let's say, 12. And if you have 12, it might give a very distorted view if the 12 have particular agendas, if they're from particular parts of the world. So we have all these kind of challenges. And I think that's something where, in order to kind of capture the lost voices of Zoroastrianism, you really have to do it in the very, very sort of technical, sort of, how do I put it, precise approach to things, where you read the text closely and you sort of feel that there's something going on, and then you work it out. And that's what Miguel Ángel is just so good at compared to many of us. So maybe we take the next one.
Sure. So Artemis, who co-chairs FEZANA's Religious Education Committee, writes in, and I think that's a question for both of you probably, is there research being done specifically on the Gathas and the Old Avestan language that you can share?
On the Gathas and on the Old Avestan languages, there are a lot of very important research. I mean, many of them done. For instance, we have in the audience Almut Hinze, who is a well-known specialist. He has worked a lot about Old Avestan texts. Her edition of the Yasna Haptan Haiti is just a model. It's a very important one. There are a lot of editions, translations, very good studies of the Gathas. And of course, on the research on them, there are many things we can share, of course, many.
Yeah, and if I can add something, when we think of the Gathas, we have a tendency to think about the Gathas as Avestan. And of course, they are in Avestan. But it's worth saying that these texts have multiple lives to them, because they were interpreted by living Zoroastrians through time. So for example, I work on Denkard 9, which has these commentaries on the Gathas in Pahlavi, and how they interpreted the texts in a, if I can call it, sort of allegorical techniques. Rather than reading them literally, they were reading the text and making arguments that would not seem to us as being the obvious way to read the text. And for example, R.S. Zaini has, as a student of Almut Hinze, he worked on the Pahlavi translation, the Zand, of the Yasna Haptan Haiti. So, you have sort of the two sort of layers of the same text. And that's something I think which is also worth keeping in mind, is that there are many different approaches to looking at the material. And we don't want to have a sort of one size fits all, because each approach brings some extra value to the mix. And when you exclusively focus on a one period of time, whether it's the Gathas or whether it's the Sasanian period or whether it's the medieval period, inevitably what lands up happening is you no longer land up seeing it as a tradition, which is something that has sort of durability across time and across space. So
I think you just answered Kersey's question, which was the one afterwards, which was, do you consider Zarathustra's Gathas to be the motherlode of Zoroastrianism? And if so, when you work with later texts, do you find or look for striking differences and or deviations? So I think, I think your question kind of answers that in a way.
I'd like to add something here. I think which maybe Miguel Ángel will disagree with me. Maybe he won't. So the Gathas are a very closed corpus in the sense that we've got 17 hymns across 5 Gathas. Plus we've got, some prayers, Yatha Verio Shemvohu Yengihatam, and the Arima Ishio, and then the Yasna Haptan Haiti sort of nested in the middle. But in a sense, we're looking at something like 17 hymns. The Rig Veda, for example, has 1,028 hymns. So, we're looking at a factor of, I don't know what the exact math is, but whatever 1028 divided by 17 is. But, the point being is that the Gathas I would agree with you that with Kersey that they are the motherlode of Zoroastrianism, but you cannot make sense of Zoroastrianism or the Gathas if you just read them internally, because they are they're these hyper elusive texts. They're alluding to all sorts of things that are not to be found there. But since they're the earliest literature, they can only be found in the later stages of the language. That is young Avestan or in the Pahlavi interpretations. So for us, at least my approach to this is that every bit of Zoroastrian knowledge production from day one, whenever you think that was, to today, is basically, from my perspective, fair game and worth studying. Now, I'm better at some things than others. I have training in some things than others, so I work on what I do. But it's not as if I don't privilege something over something else because it's earlier, or because it's ritual, or because it's scholastic, or because it's Iranian, or because it's Indian. I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it. I don't know if you would like to, what your view on this is.
I totally agree. That's why I always talk about a chain of knowledge, because if you just break the chain, that has also consequences. It's not just that you can isolate each bond of the chain. Everything belongs together. And of course, there are things that are considered more important, that are seminal for many other things, but it doesn't mean that the rest are not important. I mean, the rest are also very important. Each of the layers is important in itself.
And I don't think that you can actually understand any piece of Zoroastrian tradition in isolation. It just doesn't quite work that way.
Because that's why the translations, the Pahlavi, the Sanskrit, the New Persian, the Gujarati translations, studies, interpretations are also important, because otherwise we are just isolating things and losing ground. So
yeah, and I think there's something also sometimes lost on people, and I have to explain this to my students, especially those who don't come from the Zoroastrian community, is that Zoroastrian knowledge production in the pre-modern period is very much an inner conversation. It's an inner conversation where the texts, the people know the story, they know the material. The written versions of those things are often like a sort of shorthand to lay out and discuss problems and things. You don't feel the need to, you could, for example, like in America, you could discuss the Constitution, but you don't go and reproduce the Constitution every time in the discussion. It's just assumed that you know what's in the Constitution. Or if you say, Fifth Amendment, everyone knows what that implies. So you don't explain it. And because of the transmission issues, and because Zoroastrians operate in that kind of internal way, and this is not unique to Zoroastrianism, you find this in Rabbinic Judaism, you find this, you find this in so many other traditions as well, you inevitably have a scenario where things are not laid out in any one place. So to make sense of it, you in a sense have to kind of jigsaw puzzle the problem to be able to make it kind of cohere. I mean, that's not to say that things cannot be read on their own merits, but then they're being read on their own merits from a structural or functionalist perspective. But if you want to understand what do they mean to Zoroastrians, then you have to say which Zoroastrians have engaged with it, and that means going through time. I mean, that's sort of the traditional approach to it. And we sometimes think of traditional as meaning conservative, or traditional as meaning not modern. And that's not what Miguel Ángel and I would be saying. We're saying traditional as in something that is passed multi-generationally and is important to the people who live it. Maybe that's how I would define it. Maybe you would want to add something or disagree.
I agree. I totally agree.
So then Fred Miza has another question, and again, that's to both of y'all. In your research, have you come to a conclusion of the time frame between the Kayanian and the Achaemenian dynasty, and also a comparison in the amount of literature produced in the Parthian and the Sasanian dynasty?
Would you like Johan to answer? Sorry.
Okay, how about I take one and you take one? Let me say this about the Kayanian and Achaemenid dynasties. So, given how massively powerful the Achaemenids were, what we really have of them are just the royal inscriptions of Darius and Xerxes, not even much of the later kings. So, in a sense, we're dealing with imperial propaganda. So, Zoroastrianism has to be teased out from that. So, there's a sort of limit there. And then, as far as the Kayanians go, I think the notion of seeing them as a dynasty is is something that was constructed by Ferdowsi's narrative. Because when we look at the Avesta, in the Avestan sources, in Yash 13 and Yash 19, in the Fravardin Yash and the Zamyad Yash, the Kavis, the Ks, are listed in an order that is somewhat meaningful, but they're not described as being necessarily kings or anything of that nature. So I think I would say the dynasty angle has to sort of be, from my perspective, is not how I would argue that. I think that's a Shahnameh view of the Iranian past, the pre-Islamic Iranian past. As far as the time gaps go, I think you're looking at when you think Avestan was, and then with Old Persian, we're basically looking at the mid to late 6th century BC. So let's say the empires, let's say Darius, the empire starts around 550. Darius is essentially the third or the fourth monarch. And so it's a question of when you think the Gathas are. And I don't know, I will let Miguel and Ángel can jump in here and tell me can you add and suggest what he thinks that gap is?
That's a very difficult question. I don't think we can be sure. I mean, our main criteria are linguistic criteria, and they are not providing an absolute chronology. I mean, we can guess a time frame that is, of course, a very broad period, but I don't think we can be too precise. I mean,
so I'll be a little more adventurous and I'll make a small guess here, right? So we can see from looking at the Vedas that the Rig Veda is the oldest part of the Vedic corpus. We can see sort of something that would look like middle and late Vedic texts. And then we can see the early classical and later stages. So we can see the languages developing over time. And because we have more material, it's an easier process to be able to see the stages, though we're not able to date them super well. But presumably the same thing has happened in the Iranian world. That would be just the logical explanation for how languages and cultures evolve. So it comes right back to what's the earliest fixed evidence we could feel confident with regard to Avestan. And I think what I sort of tend to use is I look at these Mitanni documents that we have. These Mitanni documents from the Near East, sort of Asia Minor, basically have references to horse traders who are clearly Indians, but living in and working on sort of horse culture and such out in on the western side of the Achaemenid Empire, sort of pre-Achaemenid Empire, sort of much earlier period. Now, that material looks like we already have Indian religious concepts, because you have Indra and Mitra and Varuna and the Nasatyas. So logically, it looks very much like the early Vedic period. So if that's the case, then if the early Vedic is already a thing, then by definition, the earliest Avestan Gothic culture, whatever you want to call it, society should also be a thing. So for me, that allows me to feel relatively confident that we are dealing with something that is, from my perspective, between 1500 and 1200 BC. But beyond that, I can't say. I don't know, maybe you disagree with this entire sort of line of logic.
No, I was just reading the last approaches on that for instance, by Alberto Cantera, who said that the reform of the calendar that is already in the Young Avestan texts could be the result of the Achaemenid reform in the 6th century. And from that, we have to trace back the oldest periods of the Avestan language. Kellens also, and Céline Retard, who is also in the audience,
okay,
in their books of the Introduction à l'Avesta, said that that's also probable. That's a likely possibility. I mean, why not? But still, I think we are moving in a diffuse chronological period in which we cannot be that certain. I mean, we can more or less think that approximately it could be more or less that century, more or less the other, but still, I think it's an open question. I mean, we can't be that sure. So,
and there's another piece of evidence that I think supports the argument that the Gothic material is ultra archaic. Besides the fact that linguistically it looks very similar to the most archaic parts of the Rig Veda, the Gathas also maintain what's called laryngeal hiatus. That is, sounds that were not being written, but they were there, that make the syllables slightly off. So the Gathas are all in a metrical, but the meters don't work particularly well until you plug in these older sounds. When you plug them in, the meters work much better. Now that suggests that if laryngeal hiatus exists in Old Avestan, in the Gathas, and that's something that you see much less of in Vedic, as far as I'm aware, that's a very good sign. See, I don't play the game of one is older than the other. I just think of these as two siblings, basically, from a common parent. So for me, it's just, the Gathas are just the earliest stage, or the Old Avesta Gathas and Yasna Haptangai, the earliest stage, and the Rig Veda, the early books of the Rig Veda and such, the earliest stage. And so then, you work that way. But it's worth saying that the Vedic material is not datable either. And their manuscripts, the earliest material, are just around the same time, plus minus these early Kashmiri manuscripts as we have for the Avestan manuscripts. So it's a difficult game every which way. Maybe
okay, I think we have about 10 minutes to go at the max. So we'll probably try to do a quick fire round and just go down. Manik Bujwala was asking, can artificial intelligence be helpful to scholars? Any thoughts on that?
I would say that talking about the future of Zoroastrian philology, I'm sure that, of course, that will take time. It's not something we will see in, let's say, in 2 years or 3 years. But I'm sure that new digital approaches and new artificial intelligence methods will also help us in several ways. I'm sure that very soon, of course, if people doing computer science help us with that, and that's possible, very soon probably we will be able just through AA and also digital technology to transcribe automatically Zoroastrian manuscripts in different languages. For Avestan, it will be much easier because it's basically an equivalence. For Pahlavi, it will be a little bit more difficult. For Sanskrit, New Persian, and Gujarati, it could be probably much easier. But I'm sure that at a certain point, things that we are doing now in a, let's say, archaic way, so transcribing manuscripts in a very, let's say, old-fashioned way, will be done automatically very soon. But of course, we need to invest in that. We need people helping us with that. But that's part of the future. Manuscripts and texts will be read automatically with artificial intelligence. I think so. Yeah.
I have the reverse view. I agree with everything you're saying, but I don't think it's going to be helpful. I think it's going to be highly problematic because we have a very limited corpus. And ultimately, with anything connected with AI and anything, with big data or data of any scale, garbage in, garbage out. So the problem being is that if you have to encode the data for the computer to interpret it, but the encoding is a hermeneutical process. Now that brings us right back to these old-fashioned skills. So I think it's really because, take the Gathas. If you take the glossary of a Gathas of one edition and you tell the computer to do that and interpret the Gathas, they will do so. But it would look very different than what the glossary for another one of the editions would do. And those problems will require us to have sophisticated hermeneutical analyses, because otherwise we are not going to be able to do. I agree with everything you're saying in terms of the transcription and the reading, but it can become deceptive because we don't have the scale and volume of material like in Arabic or Greek or Sanskrit. So that those very small data sets will require us to be very careful in how we think. So maybe.
So Jan, there's no Zoroastrian chat GPT?
They may well be one, but whether or not we think it's good is a different thing. Or at least I think it's good.
Cyrus Mehta had a very interesting point where he said it's most refreshing that Professor Miguel emphasizes the importance of later text and how they interpreted the Gathas rather than just rejecting them outright. I think that's really important. Karishma has a more technical question. I'll skip that for now. Asha's question about the oldest part of the Avesta, I think that was already answered. And then somebody says, scholarly priests who can guide the community rather than just perform rituals may well ignite the community's interest into the religion. Yes, I think that's something for all of us at community organizations at all levels to think about. Roshan and Rohinton write a very simple, very nice thing. They had their grandson's catalog, Dr. Palani Chapuria's collection, and her 10-year-old grandson wrote. It was pretty cool to see all these books. They were very detailed and for me, very complicated. For example, there was a 710-page book on the Avestan vowels. Wonder what would make anyone spend a whole lifetime writing this, right? But I think that's coming from a 10-year-old, but it's really an eternal question as to why you guys do what you guys do and spend your whole life doing it. So
we have a lot of vowels in Avestan, that's why.
And Fred has, how do you interpret and capture the spiritual message when interpreting a manuscript? Dr. Taraporwala had mentioned that it's difficult to capture the spirit of the prayers through a philological study, and almost all scholars have difficulty in translating the Spentameni Gatha based on the above. Any thoughts on that? Or
I mean, each translation is an interpretative process, and of course it will depend on the person, on the background, on the knowledge of that person. If the person has a knowledge of the inner interpretations or not. I mean, each translation, each interpretation is different and is based, of course, on different grounds. So,
yeah. Then there's a whole bunch of other comments that I'm going to skip over. People can read them. I'm trying to see if there are any other questions. So there's one from Kai Dotiwala which says, the way in which the Gathas are ordered in importance, does it show a development of one thought form in the Gathas, or the order in which they were all arranged has been on some other basis? So basically, I mean, the way that, as you said, the Yasna Haptan Gayati falls in the middle and then it's anchored. Is there some inherent logic to that?
Well, there has been a lot of debate and a lot of publications on that, so it would be quite difficult to resume it, let's say.
But I will add something here. So, this has been, the inner logic of the text has been discussed ad nauseum, I would say, since the Gatha edition started to get produced. And, Duchesne Guimet, for example, in the 60s, reordered them, suggesting that, it's not the correct order. Now, I personally would never use an approach like that, for the very basic reason that I'm interested in how the Zoroastrian tradition understood itself. The tradition recognizes 5 Gathas. They don't say that there were 7 and then 2 are lost. They just have 5. So we deal with the 5 as we have them, The tradition orders them in a particular way. All the texts more or less order them in that particular way. The issue is not so much the ordering, but why ideas and thoughts move the way they do, and what's the kind of arc of the kind of the ideas. The fact that they're all in different meters sort of has bothered people to some extent, why that is. But it's also worth saying, and this is something that Alberto Cantera has done so much brilliant work on, is this idea that that when performed in rituals, you've got various texts and rituals being, where texts are substituted depending on the ritual being done. And so this means that we, when 100 years ago, when we were doing this work, we tended to look at Gellner's edition and the text there as a flat 2-dimensional concept. But actually, when you realize that the Avestan material are the verbal instantiations of the ritual performances, for the most part, not every text, but most of them, then all of a sudden you realize that you cannot separate out textual meaning, content from ritual performance and daily lived reality. They go together in that sense. Now, there are a lot of people who are very anti-ritualistic in the present, and I can understand why. And there are people who are very pro-ritualistic in the present, when I can understand why. But when we're dealing with pre-modern early Zoroastrianism, what we have, the texts are themselves, at least the Avestan, are very connected with ritual. In Pahlavi, we have, because of the survival, we have many more genres. We've got literary things. We even have things that are basically non-Zoroastrian material, but they're kind of what we would call Iranian, just the Iranian literary heritage. And then, of course, we've got, we have all sorts of things. We've got apocalyptic texts. We've got ritual texts. We've got texts connected with ethics. We've got, the letters of manuscripts. There are many other genres I'm probably skipping right now. So at least that's sort of how I would sort of present it. But would you?
I think Almut had a question. Actually, she wanted to say something. So Almut, if you're on there, yeah, please go ahead and you can unmute yourself.
No, I didn't want to say something. I'm just following this the conversation with great interest. Thank you.
Okay. I'm looking at the chat. I think at this point, Johan, we should wind up. It's 1:30. We are 30 minutes past our time. And
well, I guess I would just simply say that thank you so much, Miguel Ángel, for joining us today, and for I think it was I personally had a great time, and I can't speak for the audience, but it was very, very nice, and I hope people have had a chance to sort of see some of the things that we discuss and we think about, and as I go forward and I try to hopefully interview other people and we move along. The next person that I will interview will be Carlo Ceretti, who has recently been hired to take up the Zoroastrian post at UC Irvine. And then the next one after that will be Jenny Rose, because I really wanted to because this is a FEZANA initiative, I kind of wanted it to be slightly more North American to begin with. But eventually, Almut, yes, I see you there, and there will be others in the room as well. And there's Enrico, there's, we have Celine, Aresh, there's a good number of other people. I can't see all the list now. So it would be very, very, very nice to interview people and sort of discuss these various topics and connect with what they work on, and be able to see the different aspects of this very broad and interesting study of Zoroastrianism. So, Miguel Ángel, thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Johan, to Arzan, to FEZANA for this kind invitation, and of course for all the audience for their questions and for being here. So thank you very much again.
thank you, everybody. We look forward to seeing you all on Monday for the FEZANA presentation at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. And then next Friday, we have the Nowruz concert at 9 p.m. Eastern. And then we also have the prayer countdown on Nowruz Day itself. So if you don't get the FEZANA newsletters, drop your email in the chat and I'll make sure you're on it. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this amazing, wonderful Saturday morning, afternoon, evening. And, see you all soon on another FEZANA talk or on a Zoroastrian conversation. Thank you.